Hello, everyone. Good morning. Today I'm recording ahead of time. My face looks very large. I'm recording ahead of time Daf Ayin Gimel in Masechet Avodah Zarah. So let us start from the top. Hopefully it's clear. We're starting from the Mishnah. So it says the Mishnah, getting very close to the end of the Masechta. Says the Mishnah on top of Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, Yayin Nesach, which we've of course discussed for the last many dapim. Wine, and let's assume it's talking about real yayin nesach, yayin that was actually poured to avodah zarah, asur. You can't drink it, of course, and it's asur b'hana'ah, and it's oser b'kolshu. It asurs other things, if even a minuscule amount, a small amount. Now we talked before about min bimino, right? If it's the same thing that it's being mixed into. So says our Mishnah, if it's yayin biyayin or mayim b'mayim b'kolshu, if you put a little bit of wine into a large amount of wine or a little bit of water, and that's water that was used for nesach, meaning you poured the water in front of an idol, so it becomes aser the same way as yayin nesach, it's called mayim nesach, then it asers other water even with a tiny amount, b'kolshu. However, yayin b'mayim, umayim b'yayin, if it's a different species, different min, wine into water or water into wine, b'notein tam, it would have to be large enough to give a taste. And remember, the rule is usually that's 1/60th, so that if you have a little bit of wine, it sounds like if you have a little bit of wine that's yayin nesach that falls into a big vat of water, it doesn't aser it. Zah klal min b'mino b'mashu. If it's the same thing, even a small amount cancels or apostles the whole container. Shalo b'mino b'notin tam. If it's a different type, then it has to give taste. Now we're going to, of course, elaborate on this in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Ki ata Rav Dimi. Now when Rav Dimi came, said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ha'me'areh yayin nesach michavit labar. If you're mixing, you're pouring, Mara means you're pouring yayin nesach from a barrel into a big bar, a big container full of wine. So the big container, the bar has more wine. The yayin nesach has a smaller amount of wine in this barrel. We thought in our Mishnah that it said that you can never be mevatel. Even a small amount of yayin nesach will cancel it. Says Rav Dimi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that's not true. If you do this by slowly, meaning you're slowly pouring it in, afilu kol hayom kulo, even if you pour it all day, and by all day meaning you start off at pouring a little bit, so what's in the bar is mostly kosher or heter, and what you poured was not. But as time goes on, more and more wine comes in. It doesn't matter. Afil rishon batel. The first pour wine that you put in is batel. The second pot of wine becomes batel. And so, because when you put in a small amount to a large amount, the large amount cancels the small amount all day long. It says that doesn't seem to deal with our Mishnah. It's not. Our Mishnah said, Yain nesach asur hoser b'kolshu. Yain nesach asers even a tiny bit, implying that even if you pour a little bit into the bar, it should passel the whole bar. Says the Gemara, my love, it must be, or it's likely that our Mishnah, which said Yain nesach passels, nafel isur the go hetera. Even if the iser Yain nesach fell into the vat that was heter, which Rabbi Yochanan just said is mutar, is merlo. Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Dimi Rabbi Yochanan would explain our Mishnah as referring to the kanafel hetera lego isur. The problem in our Mishnah is where heter falls into iser, meaning you have in the fixed thing is yain esach, right? So in this case in the bar, you pour heter wine, the heter wine gets canceled out by the yain esach. But the reality is that if you pour the other way, Rav Dimi Rabbi Yochanan has a tremendous kula. So this whole principle that you thought the yain nesach is always makes things puzzle, even a small amount, is only true if the yain nesach is the fixed thing, is the kavua thing in the bar, in the container. But if it's the thing that's being poured, if it's a much smaller amount, we didn't define what much smaller means, but if it's a much smaller amount, it might be because it's much smaller. It might be because the bar is the fixed thing, it's kavua, and so the thing that's poured into it is not so important. So that is batel. Tashma. Now let's try to go to the next words in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Yayin b'mayim. If you pour wine into water, it's benotin tam. If it only passes it if it gives a taste. Now says Gemara, that implies the same thing. My love, the kanafa chamra di isura, the maya de hetera, where you're pouring wine that is aser into water that's heter. And what the Mishnah is saying is you got a big container of water, you're pouring wine slowly into it. If the wine has enough wine that it gives a taste, it will passel the water. But Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Dimi and Rabbi Yochanan just said that if you pour wine into a large container, the wine becomes bottled one drop at a time, and the wine never makes it puzzle. Lo, says Gemara, lo. Then that's not the case in the Mishnah. The case in the Mishnah is the opposite. Is the kanaf v'chamra de hetera l'maya de isura. The case in the Mishnah is where the water was what was aser. The water was water from yayin nesach, not yayin nesach, but mayim nesach, water they poured in front of the idol, and you poured wine into that. So again, the fixed thing was the iser. In this case, the water. In the previous case, the wine, and the thing that was kosher you poured into it. In which case, you passel the liquid that you're pouring in, if it's either mashahu for yain nesach or noten tam for water. Says the Gemara, doesn't make any sense. In the first case, so now you're saying midaresha b'maya disura. The first case of the Mishnah, which said mayim b'mayim, is water. The fixed thing is the water that's isser, and what you're pouring in is water that's heter. So then I would say the same thing would be true in the seifa b'maya disura. The seifa would also be talking about where the fixed thing is water that's isser. And it could tani seifa, but then the seifa says in the Mishnah, mayim b'yayim v'notin tam, that if you have fixed thing, which we think means water, and you mix wine with it, then it's notin tam. But you just said that if the fixed thing is you just said, sorry, that the fixed thing is not the fixed thing, that the water, sorry, is isser, right? So basically what you have then is water that's isser, you have wine that's heter, the wine is sitting there, and you're pouring water into wine. The water of isser that's poured into the wine of heter becomes pasal benotin tam. But Rav Dimi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, said that the fixed thing actually cancels the thing you're pouring into it. Amar lecha Rav Dimi said, look, you're getting too fixated on what's heter and what's isser. Let me explain to you our Mishnah. Kula matniten heter lego isura. Our entire Mishnah, the question is, you're pouring a permitted thing into an isser thing. So the container, the fixed thing, is asur, and that's why it's a problem. Now, in the Reisha, in the first case of the Mishnah, the kanafa chamra de hetera l'maya d'isura. First, you have a case where the water is the fixed thing, but it's asur. It was poured for yain, for an idol, and you're pouring the wine into the water, in which case the wine becomes pasul if it's a mashu, even a tiny bit, because, sorry, the wine becomes pasul because the water is asr, and the water is the fixed thing. So Reisha, the kanafa chamra de hetera, the maydi surah, you have wine that's kosher, that falls into water that's asr, and it asrs the water. The wine becomes asr, sorry, not the water. The water already was asr. The wine becomes pasul even with a small amount. And seifa de kanafel maya de hetera lechamra de isura. And the seifa, I said small amount, I mean notin tam, sorry. And the seifa is where the water of heter fell into the chamra de isura. And the wine is asr, it's sitting there in the vat. You poured water into it. That's the case where the water becomes pasul, if also even if the taste of the wine went into the water, even a small amount. Now, that was the first language of Rav Dimi and Rabbi Yochanan, which is a tremendous innovation, right? That the whole question of mixing depends very much on what's being mixed into what. That if you're pouring the heter into the isser, then of course it becomes batel, it becomes aser either with a small amount or notin tam. But if you're pouring isser into heter, the heter can actually overwhelm the isser because it is fixed, or maybe because it's a larger amount. Now, Rav Yitzchak, I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, sorry, Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef came from Eretz Yisrael. He had another statement named Rabbi Yochanan, and we are up to maybe halfway down, smack in the middle of the page, of a line, sorry. He said, let's say you are being mi'ara yain nesach mitzartzur katan lebar. You're pouring yain nesach from not before, like, I don't know, where it's coming from a large container into a large container. Here you're going from a tzartzur katan. Tzartzur katan is a tiny little, handheld kind of water bottle, small container, and you're pouring it into the bar, which is, of course, a big container. So here, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the same idea. Afilo kol hayom kule rishon bato. That even if you do it all day long, the first amount becomes batel as you go down. The dafka tzartzur katan. But of course, that's only referring to a tzartzur katan, the lo nafish amudei, that the stream, the flow that comes out of it is very small. It has a very small opening, and only a very small amount comes out at once. Avachavit, the nafish amudei. But if you take a barrel, which is a much larger width and a much larger stream that's coming out of it, low, then it would not be pasul. So that basically, if you mix from a tiny little tea kettle into the bar, it doesn't count because that's a very, very minuscule amount. But if you mix it from a large container, it does count. Of course, this leaves us very much uncertain. What's small, what's large, what's in the middle, what is there a ratio that matters? He doesn't explain any of this. And Tosafot has a challenge with this, of course, that just how can you give something that's so ambiguous as a halacha? But the idea behind the halacha, and we're going to keep going into this discussion, is the whole idea that it's not just the quantities. It's sort of what's the fixed thing, what's the thing that's going into it, and what's obvious from that action. Now, the final, and not final, but the one that sort of sums it all up is the next halacha of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, which is around 15 lines or so from the bottom, the first word on the line. Ki ata Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, yayin nesach shenafal lebar. Okay, let's say you got a case, and this gets to be the complicated but super important case, where you have three liquids, the three liquid problem, we'll call it, right? So you have wine, water, and more wine. And in this case, and it could be the same, of course, with water, water, and wine, but let's put it this way. There's wine, water, and wine, and some of the yayin is permitted, and some of the yayin is yayin nesach, okay? Now, if you poured a small amount of permitted wine, a large amount of permitted wine, say, into a small amount of yayin nesach, or you mixed two containers of wine, one is yayin nesach and one is yayin kosher, then the yayin nesach, of course, cancels or passes the yayin kosher, right? If you have water, we said with water, it's notin tam. If you mix yayin nesach with water, right? Or the opposite. So then the question is, what if you've got all three, right? Meaning, do you view the yayin nesach as being batal in the water, or do you view the yayin nesach as being not batal because it's touching the wine, right? So I could just give proportions here, right? Let's say you have 100 liters of water, 100 liters of kosher wine, and 1 liter of pasul wine, yayin nesach, right? So 1 liter of yayin nesach will cancel 100 liters of regular wine. But 1 liter of yayin nesach will not cancel 100 liters of water because that's 1 to 100. It's not 1 to 60. So, right? So let's say you have it all together. Do you look at the yayin nesach in relation to the water? Do you look at the yayin nesach in relation to the kosher wine? So says Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, let me explain this whole halacha to you. Let's say you have yayin nesach shenafal lebar. You have yayin nesach that fell into a container of we'll see in a second, but the bar is usually full of water. Wine. I apologize. The bar is full of wine. So you have yain nesach, let's just say 1 liter, falls into 100 liters in a vat. Now, usually, besides the cases we had earlier, it would usually passel that whole vat, right? But says the Mishnah, says Rabbi Yochanan, sorry, nafal sham kiton shamayim. You also drop a ton of water into that thing, right? It's keton literally means a container, but the case I gave, which I think is easier, is where it's a very large amount of water, more than the yayin nesach, much more than the yayin nesach. Says Rabbi Yochanan, what you in this case is ro'in. You imagine, ro'in means you see, you imagine that the heter kilo eno. Imagine that there is no heter wine. So ignore the heter wine and look at just these two things that were put in there. Hashar mayim, the rest of what's water, rabin alav is more numerous by 60 times than the wine, that's yain nesach, muvat minoto, and it cancels the yain nesach. So the fact is, and this is fascinating because it makes it sound, and we're going to discuss the details as we go forward, that even if the yayin nesach fell first into the yayin, right? So you had a vat of wine, yayin nesach fell in, passled the whole thing. Water then came in. We'll see if that's the case later. And the water basically cancels the yayin nesach, which is already mixed into the wine. So this is a special halacha for Rabbi Yochanan called ro'in, that you imagine that the wine is not there, and you look at just the water and wine mixture, the water being kosher, the yain nesach being batal in the water, and the whole thing is kosher. Now, that was the first thing Ravin said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. I mean, not the first, it's actually the second thing today. Yata Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda Rabbi Yochanan. When Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda came, he quoted Rabbi Yochanan a little bit differently. And what he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, we are now counting 12 lines from the top. Well, Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Shanu, that's only the case. El Shenafal Kiton Shemayim Tchila. It's not what I just told you. It's only if the keton shamayim fell in first, okay? Meaning that first you had a vat of wine. You then poured water into it, a lot of water. Again, 100 liters, let's say, of wine. You poured 100 liters of water into this vat, okay? Then the water's there. When you pour the yain nesach in, the yain nesach comes batal in the water, even though there's wine there also. However, says Rabbi Yochanan, Avalona fal shem kitun shamayim tchila. If the kitun shamayim does not fall in first, meaning the wine was there and then the other wine mixed in with it, then matzah min et mino b'nei or. The min, the type, meaning the wine, finds the other wine and it wakes up, meaning it becomes aser, even though the water that now fell in is enough to be mevatel the wine. So the order really matters according to the second language in Rabbi Yochanan. That's only if the water was there first. Then when the yain nesach fell into the water, it passled. It was batel in the water, and so there's no more yain nesach. But if the yain nesach was not there, if the water was not there first, then the yain nesach finds the other yain, it wakes it up, meaning it becomes all pasul as yain nesach, and putting in water won't help then because the water is not enough to be mevatel the yain nesach. Now, some learn these comments on our Mishnah, meaning as opposed to just the way we just said it, which was a straight out statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, some learn this in the Mishnah, meaning the Mishnah, now we're quoting our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says yayin b'yayin b'kol shehu. The Mishnah says wine and wine that mixed together, pasel, yayin nesach pasel's wine, even a tiny amount. And on this, Reb Shmuel bar Yehuda, Rabbi Yochanan said, Lo shanu, that's only true. El shelo nafal sham kiton shamayim. That's only if there's no water in the picture, right? So it's only true if there's no third liquid. There's water, there's wine of yain nesach, and wine that's kosher. But if there's a third liquid, nafal sham kiton shamayim, if there's a third liquid, that third liquid can cancel the yain nesach. Rowan at the heter kilo eno. So then you look at the heter wine and say it's not there. Imagine it doesn't exist, and you have just heter of water and a little bit of yain nesach. And the water is more numerous. It's much more numerous, and it cancels the yain nesach. So that is the same thing we just said before, but now about our Mishnah. Ask them who cares where we said it. Who cares whether it was said about by Ravin or whether Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda Rabbi Yochanan said his comment on Ravin's comment, right? Or whether Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda Rabbi Yochanan said his comment on our Mishnah, right? Says Gemara, well, it depends. Because man de matnila matnitin lo ba'itchila. According to the one who learns about our Mishnah, we didn't have the second detail where you needed for it to happen first, right? Uman de matila ravin ba'itchila. But when Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, said it about Ravin, he said it only is true if the wine falls into, if the water falls in first. So you have water there. The yain nesach falls in. The yain nesach canceled in the water. Ignore the wine that's sitting there. Doesn't matter. And that's where Rabbi Shmuel bar Yehuda Rabbi Yochanan said the halacha in explaining Ravin on Rabbi Yochanan. But in the second clause, there was only one detail. The second way was only said about our Mishnah, and it basically said that no matter what, if there is water there and wine there, it doesn't matter which one came in first. It only matters that the water is more numerous than the yain nesach, and it will cancel it by 60. And therefore, the fact that there's more wine there is totally irrelevant. Now, that is a very, very interesting and innovative halacha, and of course, can lead to many kulas, because you can put a little bit of a yain nesach, let's say, into a big vat of wine, which would passel the whole vat of wine. But according to the second language, if you then, maybe you're not allowed to do this on purpose, but if you then poured a big barrel of water into it, it actually kashered the whole thing. So it went from being pasul to being kosher. You can change the status according to the second language. According to the first language, the water would have to be there first. Now, Itmar. Let us learn now the bottom line, second to last line of Daf Ayin Gimel and Aleph, says the Braita. Yayin nesach shenafal lebar. If you have yayin nesach that fell into a bar, and nafal sham kiton shamayim, and this of course sounds, it's not clear what order. Nafal sham means like the past. It had been there. It had fallen into there also a pitcher of water. Okay, so turn the page to Ayin Gimel Amud Bet. Let me do that in my internet's not the best. Okay. Amar Chizkiah. Now, so Chizkiah said a comment about this Braita, and he said, Higdilu be'isur asur. Okay. Meaning, if the amount of volume in this container, we'll call it, right, was added to it, Higdilu means it became more with isur, right? Then it is asur. Okay. But if it's Higdilu beheter, it's mutar. if the Rashi explains that if higdilo, meaning the wine and the water and the wine of Isser, right, that came in, that the Yain Nesach fell into, and the Yain Nesach basically made it larger, right? Meaning it made it such that there's more wine over the water with the combination of the Yain Nesach and the Yain Heter, then the whole thing becomes asur, right? Which is not like Rabbi Yochanan. Meaning, if let's say you have a container of wine, you have wine and water that fall into that. The wine that falls into that is Yain Nesach. So if the yain nesach and the wine that's combined to it is greater than the water, meaning less than so great that the water can't cancel it all out, then the whole thing becomes asur. But if it's higdilo beheter, right? But if the water is large enough that it overpowers both the existing wine and the yain nesach, then the whole thing becomes mutar. Okay. And Rabbi Yochanan says, I completely disagree, right? So what Rabbi Yochanan says is afilo higdilo beisor mutar. That even if it was higdilo beisor, meaning even if the yayin that fell into it was basically enough to be mevatel it, not enough to be mevatel it, it would still become mutar. And the reason it would become mutar is like Rabbi Yochanan said before, which is that the water cancels the yayin esach, and the fact that there's more wine in there doesn't matter, and the whole thing becomes canceled. So basically, Chizkiah is saying is disagreeing with the opinion we had before of ro'in at the yayin, that as if it's not there, and you only look at the water and the yayin nesach. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying what he said before, exactly what he said before. Said Rabbi Yirmiyah Reb Zera, when they heard it in this formulation, this sounds a lot like a Mishnah that we actually quoted a couple days ago. This sounds a lot like a Mishnah. It seems like Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan are arguing about the machloket of Rabbi Yochanan and Reb Eliezer. Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan are arguing about the Reb Eliezer and the Rabbanan in the following Mishnah in the Sechet Orla. That's not. Because we had this Mishnah in Masechet Orla, which talks about something that is machmitz, right? If you put a sourdough into a mixture, it makes that thing, it's called saor, it makes that thing into, if it rises, it does an effect on it, right? That's saor. So the Mishnah says, let's say you have saor shechulin and shel truma. So you have a mixture of saor that comes from chulin and some that comes from truma, and it's naflo toch isa, and you drop it into the batch of dough. And lo bezek chametz, the amount of saor of chulin is not enough. It's half a pack of yeast. Lo bezek chametz, and the saor of truma is also not enough to make the bread rise, make the bread leavened. But together, you combined the saor of one and the saor of the other, they're enough to be mechametz. So you don't have enough material in the fridge. You pour half from the chulin, you run out, you say, okay, I'll take some from the truma. So the question, of course, is the bread truma bread or not truma bread? What's the effect of the truma on the bread, right? And can a non-Kohen eat this? So Rabbi Eliezer Omer in the Mishnah in Orla, achar acharon aniba, it matters what fell last. The first thing he mixed was the chulin and then the truma. The truma was the gomer, it finished it. And the thing that finished it passes the whole thing, or makes it all truma. And Chachamim say, it doesn't matter at all. Bein shnafal isur b'tchila, bein b'sof, whether the isur fell in the beginning or the second, and isur here is truma, eino oser achebo kedilachmitz. It doesn't matter. The truma itself is not enough, right? And since the truma itself is not enough to be mechametz, it doesn't matter what order it fell in. Right? So now this seems a lot like the machloket of Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. We'll see why in a second, right? Because Chizkiah seems to say that achar acharon aniba, that you go after the last thing, meaning if you poured yayin nesach in and the yayin nesach combined with the old wine and overpowered the water, then it's all yayin nesach, right? And that's what matters most. And Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't matter. If the yain nesach is not independently enough to cancel out the water, then the water cancels out, or to be uncanceled by the water, then the water cancels the yain nesach. Either way. Says Mar Tizbra, you really think that this is the same machloket? You know yourself that this is very different. Because remember, we explained, we're now 10 or so lines from the top of Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Bet. Amar Abaya. Didn't remember Abaya said about the Mishnah in Orla that although Rebbe Eliezer said, right, that you go achar acharon aniba, right? Lo shana al shekadam mesileket isar. Everyone agrees that the whole machloket there is only where you go in and you take out the thing that's asur, right? Where you actually take the sourdough out, but it's already had its effect, right? Sorry, it didn't have its effect, but it was put in there. Sorry, you put in the sourdough, the what's it called? Sorry, my words. You put in the seor of truma first. And then the case that Abai explained to Rebbe Eliezer, it's only mutar if you took out the seor of the truma, sileket isor, and then you put in the heter, and then it rose. Avalo kadam sileket isor asor. According to Abaya, according to Rebbe Eliezer, if you didn't actually remove the seor of truma, I mean the seor of truma is still in the container, then the whole thing becomes asur, meaning the whole thing becomes truma. So then Chizkiah Damar Kaman. So then Chizkiah has no one to rely on, right? Because Chizkiah is basically saying that Abai is explaining. Rebbe Eliezer says if any amount of this is truma, the whole thing is truma. And the Chachamim are saying it doesn't matter whatsoever. If the truma is batal, the truma is batal, right? So Rabbi Yochanan says like the Chachamim, that doesn't matter if there's a lot of wine, as long as the yain nesach has a small amount, the yain nesach becomes batal in the water. But Chizkiah, who said it really matters on the order, right? It matters on whether the water was there first or the wine was there first, and which one became more than the other. Then it doesn't make any sense because according to Abaya, the Mishnah has an opinion of Rebbe Eliezer that it's always usher no matter what's there first or what's taken out. So Chizkiah would have no one to rely on. Ella says Gemara, Hacha bero'in kamifli. The question here between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan is the question of ro'in. Remember the question of ro'in we had on Amud Aleph was ro'in et min ilu eno, right? Language we had before. Let's go ahead, turning my page back. Sorry, I hope I don't lose the page, right? Is ro'in et a heter, sorry, ki ilu eno, right? Sorry, that was the first language. The first language of Rabbi Yochanan was ro'in at a heter kilo eno. You basically imagine that the heter is not there, and Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore the heter wine meaning, right? And therefore you look at it as a question of water and yain nesach, and water cancels yain nesach with 60-1, and so that's fine. Forget about the heter wine. Pretend there's no other wine inside of this, and then you don't say the wine cancels out the other wine, and then the wine combined it cancels out the water. So that was what ro'in meant. And here we say the machloket is whether you say ro'in. The Chizkiah let lay ro'in. According to Chizkiah, you don't say ro'in. You can't ignore the kosher wine. Okay, and because you can't ignore the kosher wine, the only time it'll become batel is if the water is greater than all the wine combined. And Rabbi Yochanan, it's like Rabbi Yochanan says ro'in, ignore the kosher wine, look at just the yain nesach and the water, and you can determine whether the yain nesach is batel in the water. Says the Gemara, okay, that's a really wonderful explanation. But is it true? Is it consistent? Immediately, the Rabbi Yochanan ro'in. Does Rabbi Yochanan really say that you say ro'in, that you ignore the kosher wine? Rabbi Asi Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Asi asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question, which is very related. What was the question of Rabbi Asi Rabbi Yochanan? We are, I don't know, around the third of the way down, the middle of the line. Shtei kosot. Let's say you have 2 cups of wine. Echad shel chulin, echad shel truma. One cup is chulin, right? Meaning it's regular. One is made of truma, which of course can only be drunk by a kohen. And umazgan. Now then what do you mazgan? Mazgan means you put water into the wine because they always put water into their wine, right? They usually had a mixture, I think, of 3-1, sometimes 2-1, sometimes 4-1. But you basically add water to the wine, right? Which makes sense. And the irvan mahu, and then you mix them together, right? Now the case Rashi explains, Tosfos explains, the cases where you had many, many cups of kosher wine, right? So imagine it this way. You have 1 cup of truma wine, and you put 3 cups of water into it, let's say, because you're ma'arevin. So of course, that's a 25% ratio. It doesn't cancel it, right? Water cancels wine if it's 60 times. So here it's not 60 times. But the thing is that you have another cup of wine that's heter, that's chulin. And the chulin cup, let's say 1 cup of chulin, you put 3 parts of water into it. So now if you mix the chulin and the and the what's it called, the yayin, the truma wine, you have 6 parts of water to 1 part of truma and 1 part of chulin wine. But let's say you mix many, many parts of chulin. Let's say you put 20 cups of chulin into this 1 cup of yayin truma. Then you have not just 20 cups of chulin wine, but remember, each one is diluted by 3 cups of water. So you have 60 cups of chulin water, plus 3 more in the wine of truma, going into the wine of truma. So that's now a 60-to-1 ratio. So let's say you mix these cups of chulin into the cup of truma, can it cancel it? Or do you say, forget about all this water, look at the wine. The wine is mevato, the wine basically is combines the wine, and that's what matters. So now, if you are listening to Rabbi Yochanan before, Rabbi Yochanan says you are ro'in et yayin heter kilo eno, and all of the water should cancel the yayin shel truma. So it's not truma anymore. But here, they asked Rabbi Yochanan the question, v'lo pashalei, and he said, I don't know what to do. What do you mean you don't know what to do? You just explained that you cancel it out. Says the Gemara, you're right. Meikar lo pashalei. When they asked him this question, he didn't know the halacha. He went back, he thought about it, he discussed it, he debated it. L'bsof pashalei. And what we're quoting Rabbi Yochanan is later on when he actually said, you know what the halacha is? You ignore the yayin of heter, pretend there's no yayin of chulin. Look at the yayin of truma. If all of the water in this combination is 60-to-1, then the water will cancel the yayin shel truma. It's Barnami, and in fact, we said that explicitly. Amar Rabbi Rabbi Yochanan, Vamila Amar Rabbi Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Some, either Rabbi or Rabbi Asi, quoted Rabbi Yochanan as saying, presumably later in his life, Shnei kosot, if you've got 2 cups, echad shel chulin, echad shel truma, umazgan, and you dilute them with water, ve'ervan zeh b'zeh, and then you mix them with each other, and there's enough water in the mixture of chulin to overpower the wine in the truma. You look at the heter wine as if it doesn't exist, and the water can be overpower and be mevatel the wine in that case, and that is the principle of Rabbi Yochanan of ro'in, that basically you ignore the kosher wine, you look at the other mixture, and this would be true about any liquids, right? Let's say you've got soup and milk, let's say, and then you have a much, much larger amount of soup, let's say, or whatever material you look at. The thing is, you can look at the heter as if it's not there, and the other thing can get rid of it. Now, continue our Mishnah. Zakla, we're at the 2 dots now on Ayin Gimel Amud Bet, around halfway, a little more than halfway down. So the Mishnah's principle was min b'mino b'mashu, shalom b'mino b'notin tam. That if you mix together one thing with the same thing, wine with wine, let's say, even a little bit will be possible. And if it's she'eno mino, then you need to do notin dam. Sorry, hopefully I'm still here. And notin tam, which is of course easier thing because you can at least overpower it by taste. Now, Rav Shmuel and Rav Shmuel both said, and we've quoted this many, many times before, Kol Isurin Shabbatorah. Anytime the Torah has an Isser, let's say Basar B'chalav, let's say Truma, things like that, Tuma, B'minan B'mashu. If it's the same min, it's Mashu, Shlo B'minan B'notin Tam, which is our Mishnah, right? Now, but says Rav and Shmuel, it's true about all Isurin Shabbatorah. And so when our Mishnah said Zeh Klal, this is the rule, right? We said this by Yain Nesach. The Mishnah said Zeh Klal, Latuye Mai. What were they including with Zeh Klal? Latuye Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah. They were including everything else in the Torah. It's not just true about Yain Nesach. This principle is true about everything in the Torah. Now that's Rav and Shmuel. But Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish very famously say, Damri Tervayo, Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah, if every Isser in the Torah, Bein B'minan, Bein Shlo B'minan. I disagree. Whether you mix it with the same thing, the same liquid, wine with wine, or water with water, or it's different mixture, b'notein tam, it always requires taste, even wine with wine, except for 2 exceptions. Chutz mi tevel v'yayin nesach. The 2 exceptions are our Mishnah of yayin nesach. When it's yayin nesach, it's mevatel b'minan b'mashu. If it's in a min, if it's the same material, it's even a small amount. Shelo b'minam b'notin tam. And Zeh Klal, when the Mishnah says this is the rule, it's to include, what are you including besides yain nesach? Latuye tevel. Now this is also true about tevel. But according to this language, according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, Zeh Klal only includes tevel, no other isurim in the Torah. So every isur in the Torah is b'notin tam, including Basar B'chalav and things on Shabbos and whatever it might be. The only exceptions are Yain Nesech, which is if it's a min, it's B'mashu, and Tevel. Remember, Tevel is where you have grain or produce that is not yet taken off Truma and Maaser. And we're going to see in a second why tevel might be different. But tevel, if you mix even a small amount of tevel into a large amount, you take 1 tablespoon of flour that requires truma, let's say, and you put it into a whole container of flour, it would be possible all of that flour, make it all tevel, like the original Isser. Now, Tanya Kavati de Rav Shmuel, Tanya Kavati de Rav Yochanan Rish Lakish. There's a Braita that supports each one of them. The Braita are very straightforward. Tanya Kavati de Rav Shmuel. The Braita that supports Rav Shmuel says exactly what Rav Shmuel said. Kol Isurin Shebetorah. Every Isser in the Torah, if it's b'minan, if it's mixing the same type, it's apostles b'mashu. Shalom b'minan, if it's a different type, b'notin tam, then it has to give a taste. That's exactly what Rabbi Shmuel said. And Tanya Kavati Rish Yochanan Rish Lakish was actually a Braita that also says exactly like Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, because the Braita says, 8 lines from the bottom, Kol Isurin Shebetorah, every Isur in the Torah, Bein b'minan, Bein shelo b'minan, whether it's the same type, wine and wine, or shelo b'minan, b'notin tam. The only thing that matters is giving the taste, chutz mitevel v'yayin nesach, except for the 2 exceptions of tevel, food that has not yet been taken truma on, and yayin nesach. And there, b'minan b'mashu, if they're mixed in the same species, water with water or wine with wine, even a small amount of iser makes the whole thing asur, or the whole thing tevel, shalom b'minan b'notin tam. But if it's mixed with something else, then it has to just give a taste. Now, says the Gemara, why? Why is yayin nesach and tevel, according to Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, why are they so different? Right? According to Rav and Shmuel, it's true about everything. But according to Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, why are these things different? So Bishlama yayin nesach, everyone understands the yayin nesach might passel things with even a smaller amount. Mishum chumra dabo nak chavim. Right? We of course care very deeply about Avodah Zarah, so it makes sense why we would care more about this. I get that. But what about tevel? El tevel my taima. Why is tevel so strict that even a small amount of tevel will passel b'minan other food? Says Gemara, it's because it's parallelism. Gehatero kachisura. The way you make something not tevel, you make it usher with tevel. The Amar Shmuel pointed out, if you have a whole pile of grain, chita achat poteret takri, 1 grain of wheat, 1 stalk of wheat, or a kernel of wheat will permit the whole thing. Right? Remember, truma only need a minuscule amount. You only need to take a small amount. And so because you only need to take a small amount, the same way works the other way, that it passels it with even a small amount. The Tanya nami hachi, tzan nami hachi, b'mea amru tevel aser b'kol shehu, b'mino. There's a Braita that says that, or Mishnah actually, it says, when do we say that tevel asers with a small amount? That has been mino, shalom b'mino b'notin tam. If it's not mino, you're notin tam. And the point of this reason I think we're bringing the Mishnah is that the Mishnah shows that tevel is a unique category. Tevel is its own thing, and tevel doesn't get batel, b'mino, in any amount. So even 1 grain of wheat, that's tevel, that falls into, again, a tremendous quantity of wheat, will make the whole thing tevel. Okay, and that is the reason our Mishnah explains, is because it's the same way you're mater it. You can take 1 off in order to make it tevel. You can even put 1 in and make it, take 1 off and make it not tevel. You even put 1 in and make it into tevel. Tosis does point out here, just important to remember, that there's a whole nother reason that is given elsewhere, what's the Yerushalmi, as giving this reason, that the thing about tevel is that it's what's called a davar sheyesh lo matirin. Right? You can undo tevel. You can take grain that's tevel and take off truma. And if you take off truma, it's no longer tevel. So it's not such a big deal to say the whole thing is usher, because you can undo it. Unlike yayin nesach, let's say, where once something is yayin nesach or something is tameh, you can't necessarily untame it if it's a food. And so there's another reason why tevel might be different. And Tosas goes through whether you need both reasons or one, or they're arguing. But our Mishnah our Gemara gives a different reason, which is that kehetero kach isuro. We will stop here. Hope everyone enjoys the daf, and we'll pick up tomorrow from the top of daf Ayin Daled Amud Aleph at the Mishnah.